Seven on Sundays podcast is intended for mature audiences. Episodes discuss sensitive and fraught topics that many teens and 20-somethings face, but may be triggering. The content may not be suitable for all audience members. Please take caution when listening.
So that pattern of emotional abuse just got more and more severe to where eventually, when it came to the point of sex, I didn't know that I could say no, because I was always taught like, oh, my role as a woman is I have to serve the man, I have to please him. And it was never about what I wanted or needed. For someone who has been in an abusive family dynamic and you become an adult, you are going to look for the things that are familiar to you. You're going to look for the chaos. You're not, because that's all you know how to look for, because you haven't had anything different modeled for you. And even then, he ended up stalking me until, I want to say, early to mid 2020, like trying to use fake Facebook accounts, like getting new numbers after I blocked his, trying to use other people to contact me. And yeah, it was really scary.
Okay, welcome to 7 on Sundays. I am your host, Dr. Chez Leeby, with Stephanie Boye, sex educator. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, which is helpful for our conversation today because we're talking about early relationships with our guest, Haley, who is someone that grew up in a purity fundamentalist religious culture. And so that really tainted her first relationships. That's something that's important for us to explore. How do you navigate that? And what effect does that have on the relationship and on a person? Haley also explores something that I find to be universal these days. Pretty universal is the low self-esteem, kind of questioning self-worth, those things. So we get into where does that develop, and again, how to find your own worth and how to look within and feel confident and comfortable with yourself. So let's dive in with Haley's story.
I was raised in a very fundamentalist, conservative Christian background where it was to the point where there was a very extremist views that were put on us. Like, for example, women weren't allowed to go to school, get an education. Like, our job was specifically like, oh, you're supposed to stay home, learn how to raise kids, and then wait for a husband. And so because of that, I was denied an education. And on top of that, in terms of how we were taught to approach relationships, it was rather than being like, oh, learn about what you like, what you don't like, it was more like, oh, first you get married and then you start dating your husband. That was a quote that was given to me directly by my mom. And so because of that, I really did not understand like what should I expect when pursuing a relationship with anyone, or if someone's pursuing a relationship with me. And so because of that and lack of sex education as well, that led into me getting into a very abusive relationship, which was it was my first relationship, and so I really did not know what was okay or what was not okay. Like, for example, just like the way how conflict was handled, it would very much be like, oh, here I am coming to you with this problem, but then I was manipulated into apologizing for being upset. It started off like that, and then eventually it started turning to like, oh, every little argument resulted in him almost breaking up with me. And so that pattern of emotional abuse just got more and more severe to where eventually, or when it came to the point of sex, I didn't know that I could say no, because I was always taught like, oh, my role as a woman is I have to serve the man, I have to please him. And it was never about what I wanted or needed. And so a lot of times when there was intercourse, it was not because I wanted to, it was because I felt like I had to. Because if I didn't, then I felt like any sort of affection would be withheld from me, you know? And I'm just trying to be careful with the wording I use right here because I know with if you say like rape or assault, people have their own, I guess, perspectives or ideas of what that looks like. For some people, like it always looks violent, but the reality is that even though there wasn't direct violence at the time it was happening, like the point was is like I didn't feel like I could give or withdraw consent because I wanted to. It was more because I had to.
Okay,
So,
Haley, I want to stop you here because I think it's really important. First of all, thank you so much. You've shared
mhm,
so much information that is great to dig into already. And
mhm,
I first want to address the sexual assault piece of this because you're right. A lot of people do think that sexual assault is something that's violent, but I hope that we're starting to become more aware as a culture that, sexual violence happens even within relationships, and
yeah,
not being able to say no, not feeling as though you have the power to say no, not offering consent, all of that is absolutely sexual assault. Consent is yes means yes. You have to
mhm,
consent and say you are agreeing to whatever is happening to you. It's not even just agreeing to having sex and then they do something else like, bite your nipples. I'm just going to say. And,
yeah,
that's something that you have to give consent to. That's not,
mhm.
basic. So there's that. So I just want to make that very clear for listeners. Dr. Shez, if you want to say anything else to that, you can.
I did have a question, Haley. Was
Mhm.
this first boyfriend, did he grow up in your same community, your same church?
So it was a branch of the same church, but just a different location. So I only met him because I left my specific church, but I started going to a different branch. And like there, his dad was one of the pastors. So it was very similar in the sense of like there's the same ideas regarding purity culture and the idea of like, oh, the woman has to serve the man. So yes and no, I guess you could say. Very similar ideas, but not direct locations because I feel like every location was a bit different. Because for me, like where I'm from, it's more of a rural area, and so with like the people from there, they have more of I want to say a bit more conservative ideas, while the location that he was from was a bit more like in the city, and so larger relations, and so I think because of that, it the the shared ideas were slightly different, but not too different, if you get what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Okay. And I'm imagining consent was something never discussed.
No, it was not. It was actually like looking back on it, it was so disturbing just because like they they would like host these conferences called like the like a purity conference, and the whole thing was essentially just like telling women about like, oh, how if you have sex or like if you allow someone to go too far, you're like a chewed up piece of gum, or you're a car that has too many miles on it. And it was really degrading to think about how women were viewed as objects rather than not even giving women the opportunity or giving them the opportunity to be educated on how how to give consent, how to withdraw consent, or how to practice safe sex or anything like that. And it was just more about like it's like that one scene from Mean Girls where the coach is yelling at the students and he goes, "If you have sex, you will get pregnant and die." Kind of like that. But yeah, there was just so much more emphasis on putting responsibility on the woman for the sexual relationship, and there was no accountability for the men at all. And so, and I think that's one of the reasons why, just from my experience and what I've seen, that there's a lot of sexual violence in the church that I was in because men were never held accountable. And so I think I just thought that was a really important thing to point out, that if if there was some sort of accountability presented in these purity conferences, things might have looked a bit different, you know?
Yes, absolutely. If you got different messaging. And I actually really want to just dive in here for a second on the fact that your parents probably believed that because you were raised in this church, because this was the ideals of the church, that you were going to follow those rules and that that was what everyone was going to do. And the fact that you were out with probably a boy from the church. And I say this not because in judgment of your parents, but because I grew up
Mm-hmm.
Catholic. And my parents somehow had this magical thinking that, like, if I went out with someone who was Catholic, things wouldn't happen, that we were all raised the same way. And that is just absolutely one of the most dangerous ways of thinking, period, end of story.
Mm-hmm.
So your
Yeah.
parents probably had this idea, not just that you were being raised that way, but that everyone else was raised that way and they had the same morals and ethics and values that your family shared, but also that you were with the pastor's son. That made him
Mm-hmm.
even that much more trustworthy. And I think it's really important that parents hear, because you're raised in the church, because you're out with the pastor or you're at a youth group or you're raised Christian, this stuff happens in every community equally. It doesn't
Yeah.
favor one specific group over another. And
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Chez can speak to that as well. We've been doing the work that we've been doing with people who've been sexually assaulted and from different youth groups for a very long time. And rape does not discriminate. It happens in
Yeah.
every socioeconomic group. It happens in
Mm-hmm.
every religious group. It happens in every education level. It happens. And parents need to be aware of that. And lack of education, to your point, you're in this relationship and things do get heavy and hot. And then what do? You have zero, you are literally left with, it's like putting your kid in New York City, letting them walk around with no money. And then when they need to eat food, they have no survival anything. They don't have a jacket on in case it gets cold. You literally have left them to the wolves, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
This is why I'm a big proponent that we have to talk about these things with kids, regardless of whether they're going to have sex or not, because
Mm-hmm.
ultimately one day you would have had sex, Haley. You would have gone to college and had sex, or maybe you had sex in high school. I don't even know how old you were at this time, but ultimately 98% of kids graduate from college and have had sex. And those who haven't gone to college, it's the same. By the time they're 21, they have had sex. So I don't know when
Yeah.
parents think they're going to give them this messaging for healthy relationships and agency over themselves, but it's important that we get it young, when they're in high school, when they're under our roof, and we can help the narrative and we can help them lay the foundation of what values, what are they looking for in a partner. Certainly not somebody who doesn't respect you, right? Because it doesn't sound like boyfriend number one respected you in any way. He just took advantage of the fact that he was raised in a culture where men had priority over women, correct?
Yeah, yeah, 100%. And I think that the perspective that these parents are coming from when raising their children with the idea of purity culture, they think, "Oh, if I don't tell them, then they won't do it." But that's completely wrong. That's like trying to say like, "Oh, if I don't teach someone how to breathe, they're not gonna breathe." You get what I'm trying to say? Like, it's a very
And
natural thing that we're biologically programmed to do. And so by saying that, like, "Oh, if I don't teach them anything, they're gonna be fine," you are expecting someone to act in a way that is against their nature.
And it goes even deeper because not only was there this thinking and assumption that if we don't talk about it, it's not going to happen. You were also not taught and you were stripped of your voice. So there was like no training ground for even being able to speak up about anything, whether it's, I don't want ice cream right now or whatever it was,
Yeah.
but like you were stripped of having a voice and
That
in
was the
any
training,
way.
though, in a way.
So even if you did have the information, you also didn't have the voice. So it all went hand in hand to basically, unfortunately, be not surprising that you experienced what you experienced. And he was trained to be the only voice and to push his will and to not ask for, your interest, consent, whatever, anything about anything, really. So it's an unfortunate and I would say very ignorant phenomenon, because you're absolutely right that it's getting the exact result that they don't want. Not only do you have natural urges and, of course you want to, whatever, explore anything with your boyfriend, whatever, but you also are, it's a setup because you're not taught or have the experience of having any kind of voice. And that's why, like toddlerhood, when toddlers say no, parents don't like that, but it is a developmental rite of passage. It's a
Mhm.
really important separating me from you. Wow, I have a voice at 2, and I could say, no, I don't like mushy peas. I can say no, and I can throw them on the floor and I can do whatever. And maybe that's, rude and naughty in a parent's eyes. But for me as a developmental, therapist, that is really important. And that means, yes, I have autonomy. I'm allowed to try that out. I can try it within the right parameters of not hurting anybody, but it's very important. And so if your upbringing denied you of that, which it sounds like it did, then at the base level, you're back to basically prior to 2 years old in terms of
Yeah.
your agency with yourself.
I mean, just to put a fine point on what you're saying, not only were you not trained how to use your voice, you were actually trained the opposite way, to not use your
Mhm.
voice. Like, that is making it 10 times worse.
Double whammy,
Yeah.
double, triple whammy. Yeah. When you said that if you did not have sex with this first boyfriend, that you would be denied or withheld affection, tell us more about that. Was he different outside of the bedroom? Was he kind, affectionate? And I'm saying bedroom in quotes, but was he affectionate, loving, kind? And then, so that was the affection that was being withheld, or tell us more about what that was.
Yeah, so just to give more context, so with being able to see each other in general, just because like we live 2 cities apart, we only got to see each other like maybe once a week or so. And the times that we did see each other, he was like, "Oh, like I want to stay home and play video games or something." And I'll be like, "Hey, like, like this is the only time I get to see you. Can you just like spend time with me instead, or like can you give me something?" But yeah, he was very back and forth about showing affection, because sometimes like he could be affectionate, but not in the way that I need it. Like his way of showing affection sometimes would be he would try to start touching me, and sometimes I'm just like, uh, like even though there was a part of me that was like, no, like I don't want this, like I just want quality time, I still felt like I had to, because there was no way for me to voice what I wanted. And then in there, it progressed eventually where if I was like, maybe I don't. And he was like, okay, well, I'm gonna play video games. And I'm like, wait, okay, like I will, so you will spend time with me. So it sounds simple when I say like, oh, like if I didn't, then he would withhold affection, but it's so much more complex than that, just because of just how time progressed, I would say.
I think when in today's culture, where we have so many distractions of the phone, of gaming, of pornography, of just distractions where we're not even together with another person, even when we're together with them, that doesn't sound crazy. That sounds like people who are distracted, and we're like literally grabbing onto little crumbs of connection.
Hmm.
And it
Yeah,
sounds to me like you were grasping at those crumbs. And if
yeah.
that meant that you had to have sex with him in order to get a crumb of attention, then that's what you were
Mhm.
willing to do.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it.
Do you feel like in your family that you were kind of missing that? I know I get what happens in purity culture, but were you also missing the more emotional connections, the more like the, affection and attention and those kind of things?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So in simple terms, yes. To dive a bit into that, my dad was a first responder, And so I really did not get to see him a lot. And usually, like, by the time I was starting to realize what death was, I had to accept the fact that, oh, there might be a day where my dad won't come home. And then with my mom, she was very narcissistic, very neglectful of us, like to the point where like our basic needs weren't even being met. Because, like I said, her whole thing was, oh, she needed to teach us how to be moms. And so her way of trying to teach us that was basically just neglecting that and forcing me and my siblings to figure out how to take care of each other. And so because of that, yeah, there really was no sort of like emotional needs were met at all. Yeah, does that is
Got it. Thank you so much for
mhm,
your honesty. And again, this is not to blame
yeah,
everybody because we've all got our things to grow through,
yeah, for
but
sure.
it kind of makes sense why you would put up with things to even get those little crumbs, as Steph said, because
Yeah,
you're not getting it anywhere else, and so that's what happens. If we're not getting it at home, we're going to try and find it. And you kind of stayed within your community, so to speak. So, the Pickens might not have had any modeling like you didn't either,
yeah,
so
yeah, for
it makes
sure.
sense.
Is it
Mhm.
also is it also that when we get so like I'm just thinking as a parent, and if you're listening to this as a parent, the distraction that we have, is it that we are also conditioning our children that a mother's supposed to love you, a mother's supposed to give you attention, like, like obviously
Mhm.
everyone deserves their attention, but is it also that you're modeling behavior and a child is being conditioned that your needs aren't that important and that I have other distractions, and so then when you enter into a relationship where somebody doesn't make you a priority, well, that feels very natural and familiar to you.
Yeah, and
Sure.
like going off of that, I think that, and Dr. Ches, I believe you can agree with me on this, is when for someone who has been in an abusive family dynamic and you become an adult, you are going to look for the things that are familiar to you. You're going to look for the chaos. You're not because that's all you know how to look for because you haven't had any sort of anything different modeled for you. And so even when I left that relationship and I got into the next one, like I want to say a year later, while that relationship wasn't perfect, it was still a big jump for me because there were times where I was just like, "Why are you being so nice to me? What the heck?" And so I didn't even realize until further in, like, oh, like I'm supposed to be excited to see my partner. They're supposed to be excited to see me, you know?
Absolutely. And that's always interesting when somebody actually treats you the way they should and it surprises you. That tells you a lot. Tells me a lot. It tells us a lot, that, and sometimes that's a turn off. And it's because
Mhm.
I think that until we've healed what we need to heal from our upbringing, that until it's consciously worked through, that we will keep finding those opportunities to work on this. And then when we finally do, then it's no longer appealing. Then it's like, oh, okay. Actually, I do find the nice guy attractive because I don't have to keep working out the other stuff. That's my personal theory and belief, but I've seen that a lot. So I say that with experience, but I think you're right. I think you're definitely right. So, and it's kind of at the age that you're experiencing relationships, particularly intimate relationships, it sounds like you were kind of on your own. I don't know if you had a friend, mentor, teacher, anyone in your life that was able to kind of guide you or levels, not level set, but process stuff or kind of bounce things off of. I'd love to hear that because it sounds like you did break up with that first boyfriend,
Mhm.
which that takes a lot. So that's a, yay you move if it was, and it was an abusive relationship. But yeah, I'd love to know if there were mentors in your life or how you came to that place to be able to do that.
Yeah, so I really didn't have any mentors at the time. I did have friends though. And so I think the reason I started to realize that it was abusive is because I would just tell them about the things he would say to me. And for me, like the things he would say just sounded completely normal because they're very similar to like other things I'd heard in my life. And some of my friends were like, "What the heck? That's not okay." And I was like, "Really?" And like, no, like what makes you think that's okay? And so I I think at least having someone, like whether it be a friend, a sibling, mentor, just someone being a voice is and providing like a different perspective is really enough to rock the boat because I think that once they said it, I actually had a conversation with him and I was like, "Hey, like, my friend says you're an abusive person. Like, what do you think of that statement?" Like, and he was like, "Oh, well, you shouldn't be hang out with that friend because clearly they just like want to break us up." And I think that was really what caused the tower to or the caused the cookie to crumble, I guess you could say, because after that I started to recognize that things were getting progressively worse and worse. And that led to, well, two things. It was the first time that I tried to say no to his advances. We were in a parking lot and we were going to go see a movie, and he started to get handsy with me. And I was like, no, I don't want to. And he ignored that and he kept, like, trying to force himself on me. And thank God there was actually a security guard who was in the parking lot who saw what was happening. And I saw him like start to call someone, in which I can only assume at that point was like either supervisor or police or something. But when I saw that, I was like, can you get off me now? Like, he's calling someone, like, we're gonna get in trouble, even though like I didn't do anything wrong. And then we tried to go see the movie, but then it was like a horror movie and he didn't have his ID, so we couldn't go watch it. And so after that, I was just driving him home. And something he said to me, he was like, "Oh, the only reason I did that was because you picked me up and took me to the movies, right? Like, that's your fault." And for that, that really broke me in the sense that, like, I felt like I couldn't tell anybody about the fear I had in that moment because I genuinely believed it was my fault. But going on after that, that was kind of when I started talking to friends about like things he was doing. Like, I didn't even talk about that instance of assault because again, I thought it was my fault. But the straw that broke the camel's back was it was like the week before Christmas, and I think he was working at like a Subway or something. But yeah, he was telling me about how he was scheduled to work on Christmas Eve. And I was like, "Oh, like, do you think maybe you could like work a morning shift so that way we can go to church together?" And he just immediately started yelling at me on the phone. And he was talking about like how I was a selfish person and like how dare I ask him to try to ask somebody else to work during the evening time, so just so I could spend time with him. And at that point I started to shut down and I was like, you know what, I gotta go. And the last things I remember him saying was he just sighed and he was like, "This is why I don't like talking to you." And then he was about to start ranting, but then I just hung up the phone. And I think at that point I was like, I cannot do this anymore. And so I just sent him a text being like, "Hey, I'm sorry, we're done." And then after that, I was getting so many messages of him like switching from like pleading to angry, and it was definitely scary for a bit. And there were so many times where I was like, because I genuinely believed that no one would love me just because that was a message that was repeated to me throughout my entire life, especially by my mom who couldn't even be bothered to, like, I don't know, make sure I had a bath. And so there were so many times where I was like, should I just go back and make it work? But then my friend's like, no, like, you don't deserve that. And even then, he ended up stalking me until I want to say, wait, this was like the end of 2018. And then he was stalking me until like early to mid 2020, like trying to use fake Facebook accounts, like getting new numbers after I blocked his, trying to use other people to contact me. And yeah, it was really scary.
I'm very sorry for the way that he treated you. I'm also
Mhm.
very sad that that was what you thought you deserved. I don't know what your mom was going through, but it makes me sad that that was the message that you got as a child, that you weren't important enough in that way, that you didn't learn those valuable lessons of your worth. But I going back to the story about him in the parking lot, how old were you at that time? I don't think I've known how old you are this whole time you're with this partner.
Yeah, so there was, I want to say, 6 month difference. So I had just turned 18 and he was 17. And so that was like a whole other, that just like added on a whole nother layer as to why I felt like I couldn't tell anyone, because they're like, oh, well, you're legally 18, so you would be the one to get in trouble. And that was something he even repeated to me. He was like, oh, you're 18, like I could do this and da 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 da. When in reality, like I never wanted any of that. And that just added on a whole other layer as to why I felt like I couldn't speak up.
For anyone that this is happening to, you should look up the laws in your state, because I think there's a law, it's called like the Juliet law or something like that. It has to do with
Mhm.
Romeo and Juliet, and it has to do with the age difference when you're dating someone and one of you like crosses the threshold of 18 before the other one. And I think that you wouldn't have been in trouble at all, but I couldn't be 100% certain of that. You could look it up in your individual state, but don't let that be the reason that somebody wields power and control over you, because that is as easy as a Google search to figure out, am I actually doing something wrong? Because I don't think when it's this relationship that that actually would count in that situation. I could be wrong. Don't hold me to that. Haley, was this the only episode where he tried to take advantage of you? Did he attempt assault? And by the way, you're older than him. That doesn't trump the fact that he is assaulting you. He could be 5 years younger than you. It doesn't matter. If he's assaulting you, if you're 18 and he's 14 and he's powerful and he can overpower you, that doesn't matter. He could very so be in way more and will be in way more trouble than you would be. But anyway, was this the only time this happened?
I would say this was the only time it happened in the event where I actively tried to push him away. But the other times it was a lot more like, I guess you could say, emotional coercion. I'm not sure if I'm saying that word right, but just like, just being coerced and
Yeah. Haley, that was definitely emotional coercion. And that is as illegal as physical. If like if the well, I won't get into the legalities of it because, as Steph said, it's based on your laws in your state. But that was definitely emotionally abusive for sure. Let's say that. And, it does hurt my heart to hear the non deserving part and believing that no one would love me. And I want to tell you, like, I'm so saddened by that, but I also hear that a lot. Like, young people, well, and older people, I think it's regardless of age. A lot of people feel like I'm not worthy of love. And if with not with this person, is it ever going to happen with another person? Am I worthy of that? And that requires work to get to a place where you feel that, because you weren't given that security as a child. You didn't have the chance to develop that security within. So I do want to ask you about that if you got therapy. I do want to ask if you ever went to school, because it also struck me when you said I was denied an education. And golly, I thought we were way past those days. So that hurts both our hearts. I know that for step two, to hear that education is denied, not only your voice, but also being formally educated or allowed to do that. And then I also want to encourage you as you're on your journey to think back about the words that you just said when you broke up with him. You said, "I'm sorry, but we're done." I want to encourage women, men too, if somebody is telling you it's your fault repeatedly, that's called gaslighting, and it is not your fault, and you don't need to be sorry. It can just be, "We're done. I'm out. I'm done," as clear as day. And there doesn't need to be an "I'm sorry" as a disclaimer. So that's just something to pay attention to, because I think we're taught, again, whether it's in this purity culture or anywhere else, we're taught to kind of be like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, but here's my boundaries." And I don't want women and girls to do that. I want us to be as firm and clear as men are taught to be, that we can declare where we are with things and no apologies needed. "I'm done. That's it."
So, in terms of answering your question, so legally, I was homeschooled. And so, with homeschooling, the laws differ from state to state. In particular, with my state, the laws were that, oh, the parent just had to file some paperwork saying, oh, they got this grade in this class. But the reality is, they never actually have to show proof of any sort of work being done or like any sort of testing. And so because of that, that just meant like anything that I was allowed to learn was entirely up to my parents. And so since my mom was the one who was like primarily in charge of homeschooling me, everything that I had learned was either pseudoscience that as we see in a lot of, I guess you could say, like extreme conservative families, or it was all through the lens of the Bible. And I think that that religious bias can really screw up the ability to get an education. Like I remember I had a friend telling me that like she was like in this homeschool court where like all these parents would like get their kids together and like each parent would like teach a class and someone was like, "Oh yeah, world history," but it was just like all about Israel. And then there was like 2 seconds of the Spanish Crusade, but they're like, "Oh yeah, and that happened." But anyways, so yeah, it can really determine like what's brought into focus. And so like for me, like I like just because of how I was raised, like I know a lot about like Israeli culture, I guess you could say, but I didn't know about like actual world history or why things are the way that they are. And yeah, persuasive sense as well. But also on top of that, because how I was raised was all about like, oh, your job is to be a wife, be a mother. There was one quote that I remember being specifically told to me. It was that I was never going to be worth anything unless I was married. And so not only did the idea of like sticking to a partner because I felt like that was the only time I'd ever be loved. I felt like it was the only time I was ever going to have worth. And so because of that, I feel like that also really reinforced this idea of, oh, I have to make it work. I have to do whatever. I need to push aside what I want or need, and I have to put my partner's needs above my own, which that can happen in a relationship, but only in a very healthy way. Like, like if it's like, oh, like if it's like choosing something for dinner, like, oh, if you want takeout, I want to eat in, like, we can get takeout today and then we eat in tomorrow, stuff like that. But not, it should never be in the sense that you feel like you have to put yourself down or give up your own values in order to be with someone.
I am so happy to hear you say that. Somehow, did you do therapy, did you say?
Yeah, I've been in therapy since I got to college, which fun fact, I actually ended up starting college in 2020 by going to community college, and then 2 years after I transferred to university. And since I've been in
Woo!
university, thank you. Ever since then, I actually started going to therapy because I was having really bad anxiety attacks, and I eventually developed stress-induced seizures. And so because of that, I have to go to therapy consistently just to make sure like not only like to get over the trauma I've gone through, but also just to make sure I don't have seizures, you know?
Wow. I did not ever know that that was a thing. That's very interesting. Um,
Yeah, it's known as PNES, or just psychogenic non-epileptic seizures.
wow.
You know what that is? That is your body overloaded and
Hmm.
divinely, or maybe not divinely, whatever word you're going to use, getting you to what you need, which was a supportive ally, mentor slash therapist person. Your body got you there, and
Hmm.
the physical ways that our body shows up for us is just really interesting. So I'm
Yeah.
thrilled that you got the therapy you need, and I'm really also thrilled that you made it to college. I was wondering if that happened. That is like, woo, big standing up
Yeah.
for you.
But
Yeah, thank you.
also the fact
Ironically,
that you're talking about compromise and understanding that compromise in a healthy relationship, what it looks like. And I think that's what people do have to realize, because I think many young people are in unhealthy relationships, and there is a lot of, especially sexual compromise. And I think that people think, well, I'm compromising. They do this for me, blah, blah. But usually it's very imbalanced, and
mhm.
it's not in healthy ways. So I'm so glad that your therapist is helping you to learn that, or that you have like figured that out on your own, because you're
Mhm.
100% right. Compromise is not a bad thing, but in the situation you were in, it was a very unhealthy thing because it only went one way.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it also works vice versa, in the sense that if you're like, if you want something and your partner is completely unwilling to do it, depending on what it is, like, okay, you can find a compromise there, but if it's like in terms of sex or whatever, like, you cannot push that boundary. Like, they said no, you gotta back off. There's no if, ands, or buts, you know?
I agree 100%. 100%. Some people think that because you say to your partner, okay, I'll try something, that that opens the doorway to always doing that. That is not what
Yeah.
happens. That is not the way it works.
Yeah, exactly.
Haley, did you go from, you went from this relationship, you walked away, you said, I'm sorry, it's over. Next time you're going to
Mhm.
say it's over. But then where did you meet your second boyfriend? How old were you when that relationship started?
Yeah, so interesting enough, I actually had met him while I was in the relationship with my first boyfriend. And the way I met him was, I was working at a campground and he got hired there a few months after I did, and I eventually got promoted to like a supervisor position. And because like I wasn't in school, I was working every day. And my second boyfriend, he was in school, but there were certain days that, he could come in. And so on those days that he'd come in, he'd be my assistant for my job. And so because of that, we ended up spending a lot of alone time together, just because that was what our job required of us. And so I want to say that I broke up with the first boyfriend, maybe 2 months after meeting the second one. But reality was, like, I didn't have any feelings for the second guy at this point. Like, we just happened to know each other by then. And then after that, we were working together for a bit over a year. And just throughout that time, we became really close. And then in 2020, when the world kind of ended, or right before it happened, I w- I eventually said, like, "Hey, I do you like what's going on?" Because like our coworkers would constantly make fun of us, our boss would make fun of us, and they're like, "Just go out already." But both of us were very socially awkward, and I don't think either of us realized that how the other person was acting indicated some sort of attraction. But yeah, initially he was like the type person where he was like, "I'm not interested in girls. I'm interested in lizards or airplanes." That sort of vibe. Because he was also raised very religiously, but not to the same extent that I was. But he was also raised in purity culture as well. And so yeah, and then the lockdown happened and we just ended up spending like hours together on Zoom because there was literally nothing else for us to do. And then that's when he kind of came to the conclusion, like, wait, I do actually like you. And I was like, gee, you think? But yeah, and just like entering into that relationship with him was a complete 180 from my first relationship because, even though like the relationship with the second guy didn't work out, I'm still very grateful for him and like what I learned in that relationship. Yeah, very sweet, very loving. His family took me in, and kind of like accepted me as one of their own. So it was very nice. But I think the thing where the problem lied was he was also raised in purity culture. So because of that, he was very, very not sexual, And for me, I was okay with that at first because I was like, yeah, like I can deal with it. But I didn't realize at the time that wanting intimacy is just a basic human need. And I think with purity culture, it teaches you to deny that human need, which that was kind of eventually what split us up 2 years later. Because, yeah, like I put it bluntly, like I needed sex and he did not believe in giving that to me. And so, like, we never like did anything even like remotely close to that.
Haley, I think it's really interesting that you went from one end of the spectrum with abuse over to the other end where this was a completely safe, pretty much non-sexual person in that time frame. And that worked for a little while and then it sounds like it didn't. So, my wondering is with where you are today in 2024, how did you swing over to wherever you are today to more of a middle road if you did? And how are your relationships and how did you get there? So glad that you were and maybe still are in therapy, but how did you get yourself there if you are there?
Yeah, so after that relationship ended, I realized that in both my previous relationship, I was always trying to make myself to be something that I wasn't. And so after that second relationship ended, I was like, "Oh, I can explore who I am now. Like I can explore like what I want, what I don't want." And so that plus like moving 2 hours away from home, it really just allowed me the opportunity to explore what normal dating is like. And as of now, I'm not in a relationship. I actually got off the dating apps a few months ago because I realized I was still in the bad habit of trying to mold the things that I wanted into the things that somebody else wanted and not really holding onto my needs or wants. And I realized how much that was affecting my self-esteem. And so I recently decided like, you know what? No, I'm gonna get off the dating apps. Like I just want to take time to myself, especially with this being my last semester in college. I want to take that and try to figure out like, oh, like what are some other areas in my life that I want to work on before I enter into a new relationship or try pursuing a new person because I don't want to put myself in a position again where I am being lenient on something in order to feel like I could be accepted. I just want to be able to be myself. Like I shouldn't have to make myself small or quiet for someone else's comfort.
It sounds like you're on a really good path of truly finding your independence, your voice, your desires, just you, finding you really, which is a beautiful discovery process. So I love this.
Yeah. I'm trying my best. It's rough sometimes because I do miss like that feeling of being in a relationship or just even being attracted to somebody. But at the same time, I realize my life is a lot less stressful without it. But like I said, intimacy and relationships, they're a basic human need. And so I do have faith that one day I will go back and start dating again and hopefully meet someone who is a good match for me. But right now, I'm just trying to focus on school and, finish getting started my career. And so I think that when it comes to relationships, you need to have an understanding on how to put yourself first in a healthy way before you can be in a healthy relationship. Because if you don't know how to put yourself first, you're going to get trampled on, and it could lead to similar situations that I was in.
Yeah, I want to say I'm so grateful for this story, for seeing your growth in this, because one, you weren't raised with relationships and healthy relationships as a model. It sounds like your parents didn't have that. And then you weren't taught that. You were actually taught the opposite, as we discussed. So
Mhm.
here you're having to learn how to use your voice, how to understand and know yourself and know your worth, and that everything that you want to do, whether that's get an education or have a certain type of job or be in relationship with different kinds of people that aren't necessarily in the church. So you're learning so many different things, and that is something you could have learned across your lifetime. But unfortunately, when we don't teach children about relationships and it's not modeled for them, it leaves a whole lot of like messy relationships in the middle, and it leaves them to have to learn that. But the good news is you're smart enough to realize that you are learning this on your own, because a lot of people learn this through relationships that are really messy and they keep messing up and having these unhealthy relationships. And sometimes I think that can be worse for you than just taking the time out, learn about myself, learn about my needs, and learn what healthy relationships look like. So that's not easy. You're at a time in your life where there's a lot of everyone dating and you want to be dating too. So kudos to you for prioritizing that so that you can next step be in a healthy relationship.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
It struck me that your dad was a first responder, because I think if you embrace those words that forget what it really means in the real world, but like first responding to you might become your mantra, something along those lines of like, let me first respond to me. Let me take the lessons, really extract lessons from my dad, and he was helping others, but for you to really take it more literally, like, I'm going to first respond to me,
Yeah.
So anyway, I like the words first responder, and applying that to yourself might be a cool new mantra for you. I'm struck, and we're going to talk about this maybe in a wrap up, but struck with the words when you said that males are not held accountable. And I think that's something as a society, holding people accountable for their actions is really important, and not giving exclusivity to any gender, any particular anything. Like, we are responsible for our actions. So
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that out loud, because that was really wise of you, that you recognize nobody's holding these boys accountable. And so, yeah, they can do whatever. You've been an amazing, empowered voice on here. So yay you, Haley, very empowered. Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to share. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you for your vulnerability and sharing these stories, because I know there's a lot of people who've grown up in religious culture, and religious culture isn't necessarily bad, but when we make assumptions that a religious culture means that all I have to teach you about is the Bible and the rules, and somehow that's magical thinking that everything's going to turn out. It's not. It's not. Nobody, just
Yeah.
because you are the preacher's son, doesn't make you not an aggressive, assaultive type person. Everyone is capable of everything. So thank you for sharing your story.
Yeah. And like I said, thank you for giving me a platform to share it.
Of course.
Thanks so much, Haley. This was really helpful to hear from an empowered voice that you now have. I'm so excited about that. This is a wrap up session. Please stay tuned for that. It's just going to be brief, because I feel like we covered a lot. But I think the most important thing in my mind, again, is that empowerment and finding a way. I'm so grateful she had really good friends that were good advisors for her. Finding your way to do whatever your dreams are. You want to go to school, you find a way to go to school, like she did. You want to find a healthy relationship, you start by having a healthy relationship with yourself first. So those were just things that stood out to me. What were your thoughts, Steph?
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would say that I think is really important, I want young people to hear her story. And I mean, we hear this often, and then you hear the survivor victim questioning themselves. And it's very interesting. Like, healthy relationships have no negative outcomes, right? So, like, you should not be feeling scared. You should not need a security guard to come and break up whatever's happening. That's not healthy. Just to make that very clear, it was not clear to Haley, but it should be clear to all of you. And again, one of these things don't trump the other. Just because Haley was 18 and her boyfriend was 17, her being 18 does not make the behavior illegal when he is pushing it on her. Just because she's 18, that, her wrongdoing isn't trumped by his actually coercing her to have sex. His behavior is more egregious. Absolutely, without question. But the
And
fact that
I
she
just
was,
want to say out
thinking
loud,
it.
wrongdoing, you put in quotes that were, she did nothing wrong, but the
Right,
audience doesn't
right.
see that, but there was no wrongdoing, and you put it in air quotes just so the audience knows that.
Yes, for those of you who any wrongdoing, it's just that he tried to make her feel as though that was her because she was older, which is just completely absurd, while he's forcing himself on her. So, yes, just keep those in mind. And thank you so much for staying tuned for the wrap up. And we look forward to sharing another story with you next Sunday at 7 a.m.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of 7 on Sundays.
The 7 on Sundays podcast represents the opinions of Dr. Chez Leeby and Stephanie Boye based on our experience. It also shares the stories, behaviors, and opinions of our guests that we do not necessarily condone or view as healthy. 7 on Sundays is an open forum to discuss what is happening with our listening audience. Some names and details of our guest stories have been changed to protect their anonymity. This podcast is not a substitute for mental health treatment. If you are in crisis and in need of mental health support, please call 988, the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. It is free and confidential.
Join the conversation and connect with us through our website, 7onsundays.com. That's the number 7onsundays.com. We encourage everyone to do their own research. Thank you and be well.